What are the main types of risk that companies face?
Well, there are two ways of looking at risk. One way of looking at risk is to divide risks to an organisation between internal risks and external risks. Now, some examples of internal risks include injuries to employees within a factory, or alternatively, a fire in a warehouse, for example. Examples of external risks can include an earthquake or a tsunami affecting a site, or alternatively, a change in exchange rate mechanism. Now, I mentioned that there were two ways of looking at risk. The other way of looking at risk is to divide up risk into four categories: hazard, operational risks, financial risks, and strategic risks. I'll give you some examples of each of those four. Hazards can include natural events, typhoons, hurricanes, fires, floods, and so on and so forth. Operational risks can include risks such as information technology, supply chain, and employment risks. Financial risks include the non-availability of reasonably priced credit or a lack of liquidity within an organisation. And finally, and most importantly, strategic risk. Strategic risk looks at the area of competition, also looks at the area of changing customer demand, the availability of new technologies, changing social and political pressures on an organisation.
How can companies begin to manage risk?
Well, the good news is that risk management is actually applied common sense. The other good news is that there are plenty of guides out there to help organisations focus on the way they manage risk. Now, one such guide is a new standard available from the International Standards Organisation, ISO 31000. In addition, my own organisation, the Institute of Risk Management, have published a very simple free guide on how organisations can manage risk. Now, this is freely downloadable from IRM's website in 16 different languages, and it sets out the basics of how to manage risk. There are 5 key steps to the management of risk. The first step, which is most important, is to recognise the strategic objectives for your organisation and the key processes that your organisation uses. Following on from step 1, step 2 then goes on to identify what the risks affecting the organisation might be. Now, the best way to identify risks is to look at them from 2 directions, both top down from a management point of view, but also bottom up from the shop floor. Only that way will one identify the full spectrum of risks affecting an organisation. Only at that stage does one then go on to assess and prioritise risks. Point 3. After identifying risk, the next stage is to assess and prioritise those risks. Now, a useful tool to recording prioritised risks is called a risk register. It's a way of an organisation recording those risks that are most critical to the organisation, and more importantly, what the organisation is doing about those risks, when they're planning to do it if they haven't started yet, and who owns the risk. Point 4, mitigating risk. There are 4 ways of dealing with risk once risk has been identified. Firstly, treating the risk, putting in place some countermeasures in order to deal with that risk. 2 examples could be the installation of a fire protection system in order to prevent a fire, or improve driver training in order to stop accidents on the road. Secondly, terminating a risk. Terminating a risk by stopping the process that leads to the risk. Thirdly, tolerating risk, living with the action that gives rise to the risk. And finally, transferring the risk by means of insurance or other contractual arrangements. Finally, point 5. After identifying strategic objectives, identifying risks, assessing and prioritising risks, and then mitigating those risks, it's important that those actions flow back through to one's strategic objectives again. In life, it's not always possible to deal with every risk, and therefore a systematic analysis of your approach to dealing with risk will re-inform your strategic objectives. It will affect the way that the company thinks about itself.
Can you give us some examples of companies that failed to manage risk?
A great example involves the banking industry worldwide. Because of actions taken throughout the banking industry over the last 10 years, in particular the systematic and reckless risk-taking undertaken by many banks, there are massive implications, not just for those organisations and their shareholders, but also for the world generally, public finances and economic growth and so on. Moving to a lower level of risk, there's a great example of an organisation, actually an American-based clothing retailer, that managed to lose 45 million credit card details 2 years ago, giving rise to an $80 million loss and untold impact on its own reputation. Finally, there are plenty of examples of organisations that have failed to anticipate changes in customer demand. A great example is the video cassette industry. There are lots of organisations worldwide were producing video cassettes and retailing those cassettes to the public through shops. Now, the world has changed in the last few years, and increasingly people are now reverting to the use of digital media, which they can download through the internet. I suppose those organisations have faced the ultimate risk of being replaced by another technology.